welcome everyone to the very first episode of our new and exciting chess series, A to Z Chess Openings. Over the coming weeks, we will be diving deep into the chess openings, starting from each letter of the alphabet, A to Z. Get ready. In today's episode, we are going to have a look at the very first alphabet, A. We are going to have a look at the most powerful, the proactive, counter-attacking opening. Can you guys guess it? Yes, it's the Alekhine defense. We are going to have a look at the Alekhine defense. So let's get started. It starts when the opponent plays his pawn to e4 and you, instead of playing the pawn to e6, going for the French, Caro-Kann, c6, e5, c5, any of these moves, you directly start by playing your knight to f6. Now here there are many responses how the opponent can do. He can either defend the pawn, he can push the other pawn to d4, he can play his knight to c3. In this video, we are going to have a look at what happens when he pushes his pawn up. So he advances his pawns, gives an attack to our knight, places his pawn to e5. Now we cannot go to any of these squares because see, you go knight g4, the queen will be giving an attack to you, right? If you go with your knight to e4, then you just allow him to develop on d3 square. Or any other square doesn't work like h5. So the best in one is to go and centralize your knight on the center square. Play the knight to d5. Here, many of the players would definitely go with the pawn to c4. This is one of the most common response, playing the pawn to c4. They can play this on the move number 2 till move number 7. Let's see what happens when the opponent plays their pawn to c4. Now we are going to go with a knight to b6, defending it. Also, we are keeping an attack on the c4 pawn. Here, if the opponent places pawn to d4, you go for d6. You might be thinking that what is this? Is a very passive opening, right? We are not getting any chance to develop. The knight from g8 traveled in the opening itself, 3 squares, wasted the moves. Doing nothing much there, but you see how you can get the advantage in the opening going further. Now here we are going to have a look at the first one, the 4 pawns attack when he places pawn to f4. Look, on the very start of the game, he's having 4 of his pawns on the 4th rank. So the position is kind of open for him, but at the same time vulnerable, right? Now we'll go with the bishop to f5. Now, our idea is to play pawn e6, but we don't want this bishop to be under this pawn chain. So we are first developing our bishop to f5. Here, if he plays his knight to c3, you go with the same idea, play a pawn to e6. You want to develop your knight further, you want to push the pawn further, exchange the pawns, get the knight out, get the bishop out, and you can castle. Here he can play his knight to f3, then we will be capturing the pawn on the e5 square. Now he cannot capture with the pawn definitely because then you will be exchanging the queens. He would not want to do it with the knight because then you can develop and play a pawn to f6. So the best choice for him what he has is to capture on the e5 square with the f pawn. Now we can play our knight to c6, develop normally. Bishop comes to the d3 square and we pin this knight by playing our bishop to b4, pinning to the king. Here there are two responses how white can play. Either white can play his bishop to e2 or can develop the bishop to d3 square if he wants to exchange a light color bishop. Let's have a look at the bishop to e2 first. After bishop e2, we can castle. Let's say they also castle and now you can go with your knight to a5. We don't have to be passive for a long time. It's our time to give him an attack. So what you're basically doing here is giving an attack to the c4 pawn twice with the knight. Right? Here, if the opponent plays his pawn to c5, if the opponent places pawn to c5, giving an attack to your knight, then we are happy to capture the knight first. He captures it back and then knight jumps to a good square going on the c4. If he goes back, since the bishop was in danger, if the bishop saves himself, goes back on the f2 square, then we can play our pawn to b5. Here, pawn a4, attacking it, so you cement it by playing your pawn to a6. After the move rook to e1, we can give an attack to the queen. If the queen comes on the c1 square, defends herself, then you can go with your knight to d3, give an attack to the queen and the rook. That's a 4. So the bishop has to exchange it. And your bishop is kind of on a good square right now. I would say on a good diagonal right now. If the queen tries to give an attack to your bishop, then you are happy to come back on the g6 square. And now look at this position. The queen is centralized. Your pieces are doing well. The pawns, he has a space advantage, I would say. But okay, your pieces are kind of doing fine and the position looks good to me for black. Alright, this was the move when the opponent is playing his bishop to e2. Now let's have a look. What if he's not playing his bishop to e2? Instead, he plays his In bishop to e2, there was one more line. What if the opponent doesn't play his pawn to c5? Instead, he goes with the knight to d2. Let's quickly have a look. What if he plays his knight to d2? The key idea is to play a pawn to c5. This is the key idea in Alekhine defense, that you have to play a pawn to c5 square. If he captures your pawn, then you first capture the knight on the c3 square. He captures back, and now you go with your knight to d7. I agree that you guys are a pawn down, but that's just a matter of some time, because now on the next move, you are going to play a rook to c8. The queen is going to go on the c7 square, attacking here. We will be putting some attack here, and look at the position for white. Look at his pawns. First of all, isolated triple pawns. Not good at all. Isolated two pawns. And look at the pawn islands there. Well, we just have two pawn islands and the pawns are straight. Even though you are a pawn down, but these pawns are going to fall eventually. The one on the c5. So we are pretty happy doing that. That's why I don't feel like knight to d2 would be the move, but c5 is a common response what opponent plays. Now let's have a look. What if the opponent plays their bishop to d3? Instead of playing on the e2 square, what if they play their bishop to d3? Now here, we don't exchange. Instead, first we were pinning this knight, now we were pinning the other knight as well. If he castles over here, then you can first capture the pawn on d4. That's a free pawn. Now don't capture. Don't worry that he captures with the knight or anything. Here you have a move that you first have to do an intermediate move. Capture the knight on the f3 square with the bishop. When the queen captures it back, then only you capture on the d4 square with a check. Now you are lucky that it comes with a check. Otherwise, the pawn on f7 will be falling for you. Look at these pieces eyeing on the f7 square. So otherwise, if there's not a check, then that would have fallen for you. It's a check. The king goes to the h1 square, and now you can simply castle. Right? The position is good enough for black, I feel. So computer suggests that the position is dead equal, right? But you can create some chances for yourself, hoping now this pawn is in danger. You see, also your queen is attacking over here. So one or the other pawn is going to fall eventually. You can also capture the knight, and then this pawn will also be falling, right? You won't be able to capture it since of the discovered attack, and the queen gives you an attack, but definitely these two pawns are something that you can get. Alright, let's have a look. What if the opponent plays their pawn to d4 on the second move instead of playing the pawn to c4? Because pawn to c4 is the move that they can play from the second move till the seventh move, till that we are not going to move our knight, right? So let's say he plays his pawn to d4. Then you go with your pawn to d6. If now he plays his pawn to c4 over here, then you come back with the knight on the b6 square. He captures your pawn, you capture it back. There is a lot of confusion here that with which pawn should we capture? Should we capture it with the c pawn or with the e pawn? So I would suggest you capture it with the c pawn. Then you can anytime try to develop this pawn to e5, get the knights out, get the bishop out, and you are doing better there. If he plays his knight to c3, you play a pawn to g6, trying to fianchetto the bishop there. He plays his bishop to e3, you play bishop g7, following the idea, rook to c1, trying to get in the semi-open file, you can castle. Now here, if the opponent plays a move like knight to f3, that's a losing error there, because now you can play a bishop to g4, pinning that knight to the queen. If he plays his bishop to d3, not unpinning it, then you go with the knight to c6. He has to go back on the e2 square, and then you capture back. Cannot capture with the bishop, otherwise the pawn on the c4 square will be lost. So he is forced to capture it with the g pawn. Now look at these single isolated pawn. So the position is good. Now you play a pawn to d5, you capture it back with the knight. After the knight exchanges, you will be having a solid attack, centralized pieces, good position, attacking there. Rook can jump to c8, the other rook can go to the d8 square, and I personally feel black is doing good. So the king is still stuck in the center. Even if the white king wants to castle, will have to go on the open file, right? So yeah, this position looks good to me as black. This was when the opponent is playing his knight to f3. Now let's see what's the correct idea there. So the correct move there is to play their pawn to b3. They play their pawn to b3 square. You play a bishop to f5, taking control, cutting down, slicing down on this diagonal, right? If he plays his knight to f3 over here, you push your pawn to d5, keeping the tension in the center, playing your pawn to d5. If he pushes it forward on the c5 square, which is the most normal response, then you go on the c8 square. Now you guys would think, why on the earth are we playing our knight on the back rank square? So passive, so bad. What are we really aiming at? So the idea here is to develop your knight like this. And the other one is to push here and get this knight over here. Right? Also, what about the bishop? So the bishop will go to the g4 square. Let's have a look practically what happens. So we play bishop e2, you play a knight to c6. He plays his pawn to h3. You can go with the bishop to e4. Now your idea was to go to g4. G4 is stopped by the pawn on h3, so you go with the bishop to e4, attacking that knight further. Keeping the idea same, that you'll be playing your pawn to e6, knight to e7, and knight to f5. He castle. We exchange the knight and go with your pawn to e6. You would definitely want to protect your pawn, and then you have this idea in place. He played his pawn to b4. You play your pawn to a6. Now you have to slow down your opponent's attack. You cannot allow him to come on the b5 square with his pawn. Then the knight, where is that knight supposed to go? So it will be a big problem for you. That's why you have to play a pawn to a6, cutting down the opponent's attack. The knight goes back on the e2 square, and now you can play a knight to e7 with the same idea to hop on the f5 square. Okay, so the position looks equal. Black is doing good, not bad, but all right. The position is good there. All right. Now let's come to our last variation for this video, which is after pawn d6. Alright, let's come to our last variation for this video. So after pawn e4, knight f6, let's say he pushes his pawn up on the e5 square. Now you cannot go to any of these square. You're trying to centralize your knight going on the d5 square. He's not playing his pawn to c4, instead he's playing pawn to d4. Then you play a pawn to d6. Here in the last variation, we have seen pawn c4. Now let's see, he's not playing the pawn to c4 immediately, right? What if he's playing his knight on the f3 square? If he plays his knight to f3, then you can go with the bishop to g4, pinning it immediately. That's the main idea. So we are playing our bishop to g4. Bishop e2 unpins it at the same time. Now you play a pawn to e6. Castle, develop the bishop, aiming to castle on the next move. Knight is under attack. Whenever the pawn is going to go to c4, we are going to come with a knight to b6. Okay, you place this, you castle, the bishop comes to e3 square and strike in the center, play the pawn to d5. If he pushes it forward on the c5 square, then we can first capture the knight on f3, and if he captures it with the bishop, the bishop takes on the f3 square, then this square for your knight is a good square. So he captured it with the pawn on g2 to f3, and then you come back with the knight to c8. Again, the question, why on the earth would we want to play a knight to c8? But idea is the same. You want to get your knight to f5. So eventually you're going to develop the bishop, get this knight over here. He played his pawn to f4, and you play your knight to c6. He is trying to attack you by playing the pawn to b5. Slow down his attack, play your pawn to a6. Now when he plays his queen to b3, aiming for the diagonal attack, trying to push the pawn to b5 square, we can now actively play our bishop to h4. We don't have to waste time. We cannot be passive there. We want to get our knight out on e7 and f5 immediately. So bishop to h4 there. If he plays his pawn to a4 with the same idea, pushing the pawn to b5, you go with the knight to e7. Follow your plan, go for it. If he plays his pawn up, you can now play a knight to a5, attack the queen. The queen has to come up, and then you capture, cement your knight on the a5 square. He captures it back, and you can give a protection to that knight by pushing your pawn to b6 there. If he captures the pawn, then you can capture it back. Now he has played his bishop to d3 over here, and you go with the king to h8. King h1, rook to g8, trying to attack in the center. Your idea is to play the pawn to g5 square, and so on and so forth. The game can continue. The position looks a little cramped for both the players. It is closed in the center, but black's pieces are doing good. The knight on a5 is taking care of that c4. The knight on a5 is taking care of that c4 square, of the b3 square. You're having an open file there. The bishop on h4 cuts down the king, and the knight can jump to f5 anytime, give an attack to his bishop, attack the pawn on the d4 square. So overall, this position is fantastic for black, I would say. All right. Coming back to the position where he is not, let's say he's not playing his pawn to c5, instead he's capturing c takes on d5 square. Then you capture it with the knight, attacking his bishop as well as the knight. If the knight captures it, then you are going to capture it back with the queen, right? Then the queen comes to d2 square, you play on knight to c6 and develop normally. Look, initially it was looking like there's a problem with that knight to f6, knight d5, knight b6, but now the problem is completely solved. The position looks good. You can now go with your knight, rook a to c8 and this rook to d8 and continue the game. All right, so this was about the Alekhine defense. We will be having a look at the traps in the Alekhine defense in our next video. Stay tuned in this new series, A to Z chess openings, and try playing some games in this Alekhine defense. I will be seeing you again in the next episode. Thank you. Bye bye.